All right, I'm going to create a new component first. So ng, gc, and let's call this new course form. All right, beautiful. Now we go to app.html and add our new component here. So new course form. Back in the browser. So we get this label here. Beautiful. Now let's build the form. So let's go to new course.html. I'm going to delete all this markup. Start with the form element. We don't need the action attribute. Now we need 3 input fields. First, we need the course title. So we need a div with the class form-group. Inside this div, we need a label. And next to that, we need an input of type text with the class form-control. Now we can give this an ID, like course name, and use the same value for the for attribute of our label. So here's our first form group. I'm going to put the label here, course name, save, back in the browser. So far so good. Let's add the second input field. Here we want a drop-down list. So once again, we need a div with the class form group. Inside this div, we need a label, and next to that, we need a select with the class form-control. Now let's assign an ID to this element and call this category. And use the same value for our label. So for is category. Tab. All right, so here's our second form group. Let's put the label here, category. Now to populate this drop-down list, I'm going to go back in our component. So new course.ts. Here I'm going to define a field called categories. Set it to an array of objects. Each object should have 2 properties, ID and name. Development. Now let's duplicate this. The second category, its ID is 2 and it's art. And finally, the third category, which is languages. Now back in the template, I'm going to add an option here and apply the ng4 directive to repeat this. So let C, as in short for category, of categories, and use property binding here. Bind the value property to c.id and use interpolation to render the name of the category. So c.name. Now back in the browser. So our drop-down list is populated properly. We just need to add an empty option on the top. So back here, I'm going to add another option here. And finally, the third input field. So we need a div with the class checkbox. Inside this, we need a label, and inside this, we need an input of type checkbox. This input should have the class form-control, just like other Bootstrap classes. We can also give it an ID. Let's call this money back guarantee, and use the same value for our label. So for attribute should be set to this value. And finally, tab. So this is our third input field. We have a div with the class checkbox. Inside that, we have a label, and inside that, we have an input. Now, let's put the actual label here. 30-day money back guarantee. Let's preview this. So back in the browser. Okay, we have a weird layout because I made a mistake. I shouldn't have applied the form-control class on this checkbox. Save. Back in the browser. Okay, it's working beautifully. Next, let's add the button. So we need a button with 2 classes, btn and btn-primary. And let's call this create. Back in the browser. So we've got the layout working properly. Now let's convert this to an Angular form. So I'm going to start with the course name field. First, I'm going to apply the ng model directive and then set the name attribute to name. I don't want to set this to course name because in the JSON object behind this form, there I want to have a property called name, not course name. Okay, so let's set this to name. I'm also going to declare a template variable, call it name, and set it to ng model. And we're going to use this to render validation errors. So this input field should be required, and it should have minimum 3 characters. So minimum length should be set to 3. Now next to that, we're going to add a div with 2 classes, alert and alert-danger. We want to render this only if this field is touched and has validation errors. So ngIf, we're going to use this name template variable. So if name is touched and name is not valid, or you can use the invalid property, whatever you prefer. So inside this div, we want to render different validation errors. So I'm going to add one div for the required message. So name field is required. And we want to render this only if name has an error called required. Okay. Now let's duplicate this. For the second error, I'm going to change this to min length and change the error message to name field should be at least how many characters? We want to render it dynamically. So interpolation, we use name.errors.minLength. As you remember, this is a complex object that has a property called required length. So name should be at least X characters. All right, let's test this. Back in the browser. So I put the focus here, tab. I get the first error, beautiful. I type 1 character. And here's the second error, and you can see the number of characters is rendered dynamically. So if you're done with this field, let's move on to the second one. So here's our category drop-down list. Once again, I'm going to apply the ng model directive and set the name to category. Now, after this, I'm going to add a div for validation errors. This should have 2 classes, alert and alert-danger. And we want to render this only if we have a validation error here. So if category is touched and it's invalid, right? Now we should also apply the required attribute on this select element. And finally set the validation error message here. So in this div, we want to tell the user that category field is required. Let's test this. So back in the browser, category, oops, what happened to our labels? Okay, the reason we had that error is because in ngIf I've used category, but we don't have a template variable by this name. So here is ng model, here's the name attribute. Now let's define this template variable, category, and we set this to ng model. Back in the browser. All right, now it's working beautifully. Let's move away from this input field without selecting a value. So category field is required. And when I select an item here, the error is gone. Perfect. Next, I want to add our JSON object for diagnostics. So here back in the template, just before our submit button, I want to add a paragraph. And here I want to use an interpolation to render f.value as JSON. Now we need to declare f. So on the top, I'm going to declare f and set it to ngForm directive that is automatically applied to all form elements. Save. Back in the browser. All right, look, our JSON object has only 2 properties, name and category. I forgot to apply the ng model directive on our checkbox. So with this technique, you can ensure that the object behind this form has the right structure. So back in the template, here's our checkbox. I'm going to apply the ng model directive and set the name attribute to has money back guarantee. This is the name of the property in our JSON object. So back in the browser. All right, now we have 3 properties here. Beautiful. If I select this checkbox, the value of this property is true. I can select the category like development. The value is 1 and set the name to Angular Crash Course for beginners. Now, one last thing. I want to enable this submit button only if the form is in a valid state. So here's our button. I'm going to use property binding and bind the disabled property to f.invalid. So if the form is invalid, the button is going to be disabled. Let's test this. So initially it's disabled, but if we type something here and select the category, the button is enabled. Now finally, let's handle the submit event. So back in our template, as you learned, the ngForm directive exposes an output property called ngSubmit. So we can use event binding and bind the ngSubmit output property or ngSubmit event to a method in our class. Let's call this submit. And as the argument here, we can pass f.value. Now let's go to our component and add that method here. Submit, that takes a course object. And here we can simply display this in the console course. Let's test this. Back in the browser, once again, I'm going to add Angular here, select the category, enable money back guarantee, create the course. Now look at the console. So here's our course object. It has these properties. Category, has money back guarantee, and name. Now in a real world application, we're going to send this to the server for persistence.